Okay, because we already made some headway with concepts last week, I've added a little bit of extra material in to the first hour here today. What we're dealing with at the moment, it's a weird thing, but we're talking about the concept of a concept, right? So that can sort of break your head a little bit, getting around not about sort of talking about what a concept is, but how to correctly form a concept of what a concept is. Right, so I've got to apologise for that. Get tied in a bit of knots. If you understand, there's a problem of explanation there which I can't dodge. Okay, so we have true concepts, which has a special meaning for Vygotsky. I think you mentioned the word genuine as perhaps a better word than true. I'll give some better explanations again, but specific idea. And spontaneous is another much broader category of concept, and then actual concept. Actual is used, and again, in an ambiguous way. Actual meaning how concepts are. They're not pure spontaneous, not pure true, but your typical kind of concept. It also means that it's a concept which is, like reality, concrete and not some kind of ideal type. Okay, we'll get to that in a second. The main thing to understand about how concepts have to be understood is that they're not to be distinguished by characteristics of them. So you can't look at a couple of concepts and ask yourself, which type of concept is this? Should I put it in this box or that box? Right? That would be approaching concepts in a way that's true to the method of pseudo-concepts. For example, the natural world and theories of the natural world provide some really archetypal examples of this. Two historic concepts of the natural world in our modern scientific world. One according to Linnaeus, another according to Darwin. Are people familiar with who Linnaeus is? No. Linnaeus wrote, I think we're looking at the late 18th century, or maybe even middle or early 18th century, I'm not sure exactly, but that sort of time. He wrote a fantastic big book, like an encyclopedia, that listed all the different animals and plants in the world, in their kingdoms and genera and species and types, right? In a great big taxonomy, right? And everything was categorised according to their features, like, for example, did they have scales or did they have skin? Did they have beaks or did they have mouths or whatever? And you could spot some animal or plant, pull out your Linnaeus and find that that's a so-and-so. And the two Latin words by which things in the natural world are named come from Linnaeus, right? Linnaeus. In those days, so maybe it's even a bit early in the 18th century, all scientific people gave themselves Latin names, like Copernicus and so on. Right? He was just a Pole, he wasn't a Latin figure. Yeah? So, every animal had a specific concept which depended on its various features. Now, Darwin came along and he created a completely different concept of the natural world. And what you had now was lines of development. That each of those same creatures, which have certain features, and you can't get away from the fact that a turtle has a shell and a head and four flippers and lives in the sea, and think that's what a turtle is. But it was a turtle because it belonged to a certain line of development when it went back to pre-turtles, you know, and things that weren't quite turtles, and things that weren't turtles at all, right? But had developed over years, and he was able to figure this out mainly by looking just at the way things are and reasoning it. You couldn't actually watch this developmental process taking place, except there was this fantastic occasion on the Galapagos Islands where we actually witnessed the differentiation of species of bird, with the beaks getting a bit longer or shorter according to it. So he was able to actually witness it in a very marginal way. Okay, so Darwin produced a true concept of the natural world, because he didn't categorise all of the things according to their features, though you still needed the features to recognise what they were, but he formed a concept according to a theory of how they came about. So, okay, so what I'm going to do here is try and give you an idea of concepts which is equally scientific. That is to say, there isn't a set of tick boxes to go through the concept and say, this one must be scientific, or this one's religious, or this one's everyday according to this or that feature. It depends on where they've come from, right? So the little diagrams illustrating two roads, right? The two buses look the same, but one's taking the high road, one's taking the low road. They are two different concepts, not because they look different, but they're on different roads. So it's the lines of development rather than the types of concept. Or if you like, instead of when we want to talk about types of concept, what we're really talking about is lines of development. Okay? Now, the first one is got various names. We call them spontaneous concepts. Sometimes they can be called everyday concepts, and sometimes they're called empirical concepts. They're called empirical concepts because they arise directly out of experience. And empiricism is the doctrine of experience being the source of knowledge. So this is a concept which realises the doctrine of empiricism. If you have experience of some object, you form a concept of it. And how do you form a concept of it? According to its features. So, for example, anyone in this room, if I were to bump into you in the street next day, I'll say, oh, hello, and some of you actually remember your names, and I'll remember you really basically just by your hair, your clothes, you know, gender and things like that. I don't know anything about you. Right? So I don't have really an adequate concept of you, but I can still recognise you. But the fact that I can recognise you and say, oh, that's Gavin, remember, from the class, doesn't mean I know anything about you at all. Right? There's a difference between being able to recognise something in a crowd and having a concept of it. Right? But the fact is, yes, Russell.
Can I just ask, this is getting a bit, well, philosophical-ish.
You can't avoid it. It's a concept of concepts. Go for it.
But I'm just wondering, how can you even know yourself?
What do you mean? How can a person know themselves?
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, through others. Through, I mean, this is another issue, isn't it? This is the psychology of identity. But I think widely accepted story, which is put very nicely by Mead, George Herbert Mead, who's a younger colleague of Dewey, who did about I and me. You know the story? That you grow up knowing I, but the me you learn about from others, which basically people tell you about yourself or by their reaction to it. People run for cover when you come into the room. You didn't realise you were such a horrible person, but you get to know it. Right? So, generally speaking, that's how you do it, through others. What does this mean for concepts? Yeah, relevant to concepts, because you can only... All perception is mediated, right? But when you're looking at the spontaneous concepts, the mediation is just immediate, in that sense. Or that's a contradiction in terms, I know. But it's sensual. It's just the situation you're in, the visual. Not all concepts are visual, of course. They might be theoretical concepts. But however they're given to you in the senses, you'll recognise them coming in the same guise in the future, right? So that's how you get to know them. And if someone tells you Andy Blondin is that crackpot, that's the first bit of information about you. Okay? So, first thing, it's recognised by its features. It's acquired interpersonally. I don't think it's possible to form a concept of something simply by exposure to something sensually. There's always a social connection there. That is to say, if you see a sunset, you won't really have a concept of it unless you've been encultured in some way to appreciate that. So it's not when I say that concept formed according to its features, I'm not trying to pretend that that's simply a sensual thing and that society's out of the picture. That the senses are culturally developed Your sensitivities are culturally developed, but nevertheless you're judging something by how it immediately appears to you. And that word appears, which in Latin is phenomena, means just that. It's an appearance. It's not the thing itself. Okay? The other thing is it's unsystematic. That's to say, if you form a concept of something, you just take it as it is in front of you. You come across something else, you have a concept of that, you'll recognise that. So it's unsystematic. When I've brought in again this little set theory diagram showing A and B overlap. So you've got a certain characteristic, it might be scaly skin, another characteristic, no legs, and if they overlap, scaly skin, no legs, animal, it's a snake, or it might be a fish, or whatever. So that's how concepts are formed, by combining different features till you've got enough tick boxes ticked and crossed that you can identify what it is. And when you can connect that set of features to a specific word in the language that's associated with those set of features, then that's a pseudo-concept, which we did last week. Right? And it's the idea of a concept which is most favoured by bureaucracy. So you can, if you want to get to know somebody, you get them to fill out certain check boxes, experience, age, gender, whatever, and then you know them. Right? Now, a true concept is not from experience, but from learning, so to speak. I call it book learning, but don't take book learning literally. It's basically, institutional learning. But book learning is a good expression because it's, so it's expression in language. It's not from experience, it's book learning. Right? And if you're an empiricist, you reject it. Useless, book learning. Right? Same time, people go out of their way to get a university education and get some book learning. Right?
So we shouldn't read books. We shouldn't read books to try and learn what empiricism is.
Of course we should read books. Of course. It's another avenue towards knowledge, isn't it?
I mean, from an empirical.
Yeah, that's right. If you're talking about when empiricism was all the rage, you're talking about sort of 1700, something like that in England anyway. People absolutely dismissive. Just throw away books, use your eyes, turn to nature. This is God's own book in front of you, read that. And there's another expression, whose expression is, that's right. The George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, said the only book you need is the book of your own conscience. And you think, well, Quakerism, like fundamental religion, but he's writing in 1660, Jesus, that's exactly what the most advanced scientific philosophers were at the same time. And George Fox used to talk about experiments. By experiments, he means actually looking into your soul to find the light of Jesus. Now, that's really weird for a scientific person reading today, but he was spot on in terms of the most advanced scientific philosophical thinking of his time. Because, empiricists doesn't seem to be talking about spirits and ghosts and Jesus and things like that. He seems to be talking about very concrete things about plants and animals and collecting all these little animals in glass boxes. That was the project of empiricism. All the butterfly collecting, all that rose from the great age of British empiricism, right? But also empirical psychology meant introspection, right? Looking into your own mind, and empiricism in theology meant discovering God through the direct access of your own soul, okay? Which seems like a huge digression, but someone raised about, did empiricism really mean don't read the book? It very much did. In religion it meant don't bother reading the Bible. You can, well, it's not quite. They didn't actually say don't read the Bible. They said you can only read the Bible by finding its truth within you. And then with the guidance of the Spirit within you, you will be able to understand the Bible. There were people in the 17th century who said don't read the Bible, but that's not a true representation of what the Quakers said. Okay? So But nonetheless, book knowledge is in fact the foundation of civilization. Yeah? Writing, invented in 3 or 4, I think 4 different places in history, in Sumeria, someone will have to correct me, in China, in the Andes, Latin America, and somewhere else as well, and then spread. And it's on the basis of forms of writing that knowledge was accumulated, not just by verbal storytelling and so on, but could be accumulated in a much more reliable and powerful way. And this is why we have this, for better or for worse, the world we live in today, thanks to the accumulation of institutional knowledge. So some features of true concepts which follow from them being book knowledge. That they're part of a system. Okay? Sure, sometimes someone just sits down and thought, I'm going to write a book, like an autodidact. Someone that's retired, had a life experience, I'm going to write a book, the true meaning of everything. And this goes on. But generally speaking, that kind of writing, which I'm talking about, which is the most influential and developed, it always happens through institutions. For example, the church has a couple of thousand years of accumulated writing, and people who are trained in the church read the old books, write new ones, write commentaries, pass it on. Beginning from the alchemists through Galileo and Kepler and all that, you had to develop scientific knowledge. Each one passed their books and their writing on to a generation afterwards, continuing working on the same problems, resolving things, generating new problems. So when this happens, people develop a key concept, like, for example, the sun being the centre of the solar system. Then all the observations have to be redone, because people thought that the Earth was the centre of the universe. They've got all these observations, to completely redo them and rebuild the science of cosmology. The cell was discovered, found that the conservation energy principle comes along, do away with life forces. So when key concepts come along, whole sciences are created, thanks to Darwin, one has the foundation for biology and so on. And the concepts are developed in a systematic way. As to say, you have a basic sort of principle, it's called under question, it's criticised, problems arise, people develop sort of subsidiary concepts that are related to that, and so it goes on, it develops. Like Darwin sees the natural world developing one thing after another, like adapting to problems and developing different streams and strains. It develops, in that sense, systematically. I've done a real hash of explaining what system is, but can we see the difference between book knowledge, which is developed perhaps through the church, perhaps through universities, or whatever, through the law, with their courts and so on, these different institutions, a difference between that and what we had before, the spontaneous concept, which you're confronted with something, you form a concept of it, because you just remember, oh look, he's got a bit of grey in his hair and he's a bit like this, I can remember that guy, whatever. This is it's part of a system of concepts. So for example, the concept of integral and differential really means, can only be understood in the context of mathematics. I mean, there are different words, but the concepts I was indicating when I say integral and differential belong to calculus, and those concepts can only be understood within the context of the whole development of calculus. If I tried to explain to someone that hasn't studied mathematics here what a differential means, it's just wasting your time, right? Just take a year off and work on it and you can get there. Now, the other thing is they're culturally transmitted. That generally speaking, for the overwhelming majority of people and concepts, these true concepts that are part of a system and are based in systematic knowledge developed in an objective written culture, come to you through contact with an institution. Like you learn the concepts of mathematics generally by going to school and university and being taught mathematics. There are exceptional people throughout history, right? Like Gauss, that turned up at school at 11 years old and completely, flummoxed his teacher with mathematical theories that completely left the teacher behind. Somehow or other he'd work these things out. They're exceptional, like they're 1 in a billion. And mathematics produces some amazing cases. Generally speaking, systematic knowledge and the true concepts that are part of it reach you through culture. For instance, you have a book and you have people that introduce you to that book, take you through exercises, critique you, ask you questions about it, hold seminars and whatever, and so on. And that's how you get a true concept. The other thing about true concepts is that they don't represent actually a collection of features. Although, when you know what it is, you can sort of list the features. But it's not fundamentally about features. It's that each concept is a problem and a solution. So, for example, can I improvise an example of this? But in particular, let's say take a concept like structure and agency. They're concepts out of social theory. Where did they come from? I can sit down and explain structure means this, agency means that. Okay, but they came out of the history of development of social theory when certain problems arose and people argue about them probably for 25 or 30 years and eventually develop, what we've got here is two concepts that are sort of complement to each other, their structure and agency. And the formation of those, here's an example to make it easy, but sexism, right? That word was invented in 1968. It's impossible to say, I think, exactly who invented it, but it was in 1968. The year can be pinned down and on the east coast of America. Right? And it spread very rapidly from there. Didn't mean that sexism didn't exist before then. That would be an absurd idea. But social life had developed to a point, the experience of the civil rights movement, and the idea of racism and the idea of liberation from racism made a hell of a lot of women in America come to conceive of their own situation being very succinctly named by taking the word racism and translating it into gender terms. Right? So sexism is a classic case of a word that arises as a problem solution. It's not a solution, but by naming the problem, it clearly implied a solution. That is to say, sexism had to be fought and eliminated. Antibiotic is a sort of obvious case from technology. All technological concepts are obvious problem-solution pairs. Yeah? Scientific concepts come up because they've solved a certain problem in the development of that science, like the structure agency one. So when the concept enters the language by being associated with a word, and according to Vygotsky, the word is always ready and waiting when the concept arises, it tends to spread. It's transmitted culturally, and it massively overextends the area in which it made sense, really. So, for example, interface. Interface is a concept, I think it appeared in sort of about the 60s or 70s in the military industry, and they were concerned with interfacing their different bits of technology to form more powerful systems. But everyone knows what interface means now. Well, I think so. You've got a general idea that you have two different systems that talk to each other, so there's an interface. Right? So I'm not saying that people don't understand it because they don't know where it came from. I'm just saying that the word began in the area of technological development, but it caught on. Right? And that happens to all concepts. So, for instance, I mentioned last week the idea of a motorway. A motorway is a solution to the problem of building a large city. Also made some people a hell of a lot of money. Good way of selling a lot of cars and a lot of other things. But to be sort of naive about it, it was a problem of how to allow a very concentrated development of the city and for people who live out in the suburbs to be able to get in and out. Right? So you built these motorways. Now, they arose in a very specific juncture. I think we're talking about immediate post-Second World War in New York, or was it interwar? I'm not sure. Maybe it's interwar. Interwar, it'd have to be, yeah. Sorry?
Yeah, when they knocked out huge parts.
Yeah, when they started knocking down all these neighbourhoods and so on.
That was interwar.
Interwar, yeah. Yeah, you're right. Now, you don't have to know, and indeed, as you can see, you don't actually know that story. But that word, or the concept of a motorway, originates from the solving of that problem. It doesn't mean a road of a certain number of lanes that has a certain number of exits and entry roads with bridges over it or something. They're features that allow you to recognise when you see one, but it's not really what a motorway is. A motorway is a solution to the problem of getting large numbers of cars through cities to solve that problem. Right? So they might be outmoded through specific changes in technology and patterns of social life, for example. And if you just thought motorways were features of numbers of lanes and exits and entry lanes and so on, you'd say, well, how can a motorway be outmoded? Because you can always make roads like that. Okay, but if you understand it as a solution to a specific problem, then you actually understand the concept and it's part of a system. Now, I don't know if anyone picked this up, but there's a certain ambiguity in what I've said about system, because I'm talking about system more or less connected with institutions, but a way of life is also a kind of institution. So there's actually not a rigid, sharp line between an institution and a way of life. Likewise, there is a certain fuzziness between a true concept and an everyday concept. There's a certain fuzziness because if you grow up in a certain culture, you learn certain words transmitted to you culturally that may have quite indefinite meanings that can't really be justified, like the concept of papal infallibility can be given very definite, definition by the Catholic Church or whatever. Whatever you think of it, it's got a definition, and you can find it there in the appropriate books of the Catholic Church. But there are concepts you pick up culturally that are a little bit fuzzy. They are true concepts, but they don't have the full kind of characteristics of a true concept, because the institution is not itself a sort of a firm and regular institution. The importance of an institution is this. Institution has rules. Everything is in an institution for a specific reason, right, and is validated for a certain reason. As a result, contradictions arise. Problems arise. The thing breaks at a certain point. And when you have a break in an institution, where, they're going on in law all the time. I mean, if institutions didn't necessarily generate contradictions and breakdowns, then we would have done away with the law courts years ago, because the law would be black and white and easy. You can say, you've done something, look up the book, section 6A75, 10 years for you. But the thing is that no matter how often you amend the law, you keep tossing up new contradictions. Right? So, that's why concepts arise as problem solutions in institutions. Because if you don't have those rules and those rigid, definite roles and meanings, you can't have contradictions. You just have people going different ways, different habits, fashions or whatever. Right? So that same issue can arise in a way of life. Insofar as a way of life, say like in Malaysia, where this is the way we behave and nothing else will be accepted, you spit on the pavement, there's a $10 fine, full stop, right? Maybe I'm thinking of Singapore. Well, Singapore, yeah, sorry. The difference between everyday life and an institution, in the case of Singapore, is really 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Right? But if you take a place like Australia, there's a big difference. The majority of people's lives are not like being in an institution at all. It's very laissez-faire. Right? So people can do things that make no sense to the person next door, and nothing particularly happens about it. Right? But in an institution, if two people are saying opposite things, someone's got to blow. Right? And that's when you have, say, in the development of some social theory, if you have two leading theorists saying opposite things, you know, they'll hold a conference and call for papers and whatever, resolve it, and then some new concept will come out of it. It can't just sit there. So that's the sort of difference between a way of life and an institution. And true concepts are generally associated with institutions, where if there's a contradiction, there has to be a concept come up that encaptures that and gives a solution to it, eventually. Right? Now, that said, actual concepts. The spontaneous concept arises immediately from experience. Children begin to form spontaneous concepts very early on, and by the time they're young teenagers, they can name everything in their world correctly. Whether it's situations, objects, practices, they can name them all correctly, but they don't yet have a conception of the huge socio-cultural, historical world around them, which generates things as they are. Right. On the other hand, you have people that attend university, medical training is the best example here, who attend university perhaps for years and years and years, and if they're studying medicine, they'll be able to name every disease known to mankind and tell you exactly what the appropriate treatment is, what all the symptoms are. They can name and describe every part of the human body and so on. And then after, I mean, medical education is a lot better now than it used to be. So what I'm saying is really outdated by a decade or so. They're then chucked out and sent in to be an intern in hospital, and the first day they turn up in the emergency ward, someone walks through the door and they're absolutely all at sea. They don't know what to do, right? They misdiagnose things. They end up, calling someone to give the patient a shot of morphine to calm them down or whatever. So that then begins the real life experience. Right? An actual concept, a real concept is one that has two paths of development. It's a joining of experience building up from the base and book knowledge, if you like, coming down from above. Culturally acquired book knowledge meeting up with the sensuously acquired practical knowledge of everyday life. So when the medical student walks into hospital, at first they don't know whether they're Arthur or Martha, but they begin to recognise things. They make mistakes. There's a senior around that corrects their mistakes and say, oh, that's right, of course, I forgot about that. Oh, yes, I mustn't rush straight in to do this. I should wait, right? And then, if you like, 20 years down the track, you have a mature, knowledgeable person that both has mastered the scientific knowledge of their discipline and has broad life experience as well. And then when they form a concept of a particular illness, they understand how it affects the family, the sensitivity of approaching someone about that, the dangers of offering this particular medication, how it's often associated with this or that family situation or other illness, and so on. So all actual concepts have their roots both in institutional learning and life experience. I say all concepts have some connection with institutional learning because it's as ideal type, a true concept arises out of and belongs in an institution or a definite theory or science. But the world we live in, we're completely sort of interpenetrated by different institutional concepts every day. I mean, I don't know, maybe if you just listen to Triple J all day and walk around with your earphones on, this may not be the case. But generally speaking, if you talk to people, read a newspaper every so often, watch the news, listen to ABC radio occasionally, you get snippets, words, ideas, thoughts from all the different sciences that are going on. So there can't be really any concept that doesn't bear some mark of institutional knowledge. Yes?
Can I just ask, and perhaps I'm just drunk on this at all, but think of a traditional community, let's say in rural Ethiopia, where there is no books, there are no schools, there isn't that sort of institutional learning like we have here, not even newspapers, radio, you know,
pre-literate societies.
Yeah. How do they true concepts form?
Yeah, well, my position is that pre-literate societies do have true concepts. I have to say this is a controversial position. It's not the position widely held among Vygotskyists, but it's, to me, to deny that, it leads to absurdities. The issue, I'm presenting this to you in sort of broad terms, where I say institutions, spontaneous, and then I come along and say, actually, it's not cut and dry like that, right? That's a way of presentation, because the kind of education that a child will get in a rural village in outback Ethiopia is really beyond our experience. So I'd have to reframe what I said about them to meet that situation. The issue there really is access to true concepts. In the traditional African way of life, the institutions that are relevant are usually called the elders. And legal disputes over ownership or disputes over marriage or such things are usually dealt with by a group of elders, sometimes with a chief overseeing it. And they understand precedent, they understand all the mythology, and if there's a discussion about it, you have all the traditional stories that are brought to bear, and their institutional knowledge is contained in those stories and in the accumulated wisdom of the elders. It's unlikely, I can put it, that knowledge is relatively more or less diffused, but it's there, yeah? and it's absolutely essential to the continued existence of those peoples. Right? Even though it isn't written in a book, the authority of the elders in that community and their ability to confer together and make decisions about their life, so long as that exists and continues, then they can maintain a way of life that has law, yeah, right and wrong. It is a civil society, in other words. So there's no doubt that civil society, that which is specifically human, doesn't necessarily require literacy. But literacy gives an enormous strength to that. So if, for example, you're not reliant on the elders remembering precedents and explaining through a traditional story why something might be like this, might be like that, but you can simply dial up the internet, get the appropriate schedule of the law and read it yourself, then that's different. But essentially it's still the same. Yeah? So you do have institutions in the traditional pre-literate way of life, and I would say that they're usually contained within the authority structure of the community. Yeah? We have that here as well, but that would situate closer to what you'd call everyday concepts. Yes.
I would think that it's also involved in technique. Like they would have a very specific way of fishing. We fish like this, we use this tool, we build it this way, and that gets developed, and the concept of what a spear is.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of discussion on the XMCA list about institutionalised learning and schooling. But all cultures have a way of passing on their knowledge to the younger generation. And not just happen to do it, but do it in specific ways that's as old as humankind. And generally speaking, the most widespread way that happens in terms of learning the basics of a community is through some kind of apprenticeship. Children will hang around usually, well, it varies. There's no single pattern, but children will become accustomed and begin at one level or another to participate in the daily productive life of a community at a very, very young age. I have a friend in South Africa who says he's observed that babies, like sort of crawling babies, he's observed them able to catch a rat, light a fire and cook the rat and eat it without guidance, right? Now you think, I mean, that's a fantastic level of knowledge and skill and capability, right? And not get sick on it as well. It's just very different, but certainly that implies a very developed knowledge of how things are done.
It would revolutionise childcare here, wouldn't it?
It would, yeah. Some of the people would get a bit upset about it, I'm sure, but there are many ways of skinning a cat. Don't dare skinning a cat with an arm around by those pussies. Anyway, we've dealt with that. The distinction between everyday life and institution, but recognising that institution isn't a cut and dry thing, distinct, absolutely from everyday life. Yes.
So then you were saying that your thoughts on it are controversial. So what do other people within? Because I mean, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I can't really advocate for what I don't believe in, but I can't explain its roots. In 1929, Vygotsky, together with Luria, wrote a book called Ape, Primitive Man and Child, which was intended to show that the human being that we have here and now is a product of three different processes of development. The development of the human species, the development of culture, and the development of the individual, the ontogenesis of the individual. Okay, it did that, and that's true, and there were a lot of true things in that book, but it also included a very mistaken analysis of the thinking of what was taken as the substitute for a primitive man, so-called at the time, which Vygotsky quite clearly said did not exist, doesn't exist anywhere in the world, but what you do have at that time in the late 20s in the Soviet Union with plenty of people that were still living in outside the normal, the growing and spreading industrial world that they were building, right? So it was still possible to go around the Soviet Union and find people living in villages without any contact with literacy, right? And later in 1930, Luria went on an expedition and did psychological tests, mainly focusing on cognition with these people, and compared them, the same group of people, as they were inducted into the collectivised industrial economy of the Soviet Union, interested in watching the changing ways of thinking as they went from the pre-literate village life into a relatively advanced industrialised economy. And they found that. Michael Cole did similar work in West Africa in the 60s. Right? But what comes out of it, at that time, Vygotsky was quite mistaken about what he took to be a true concept. He had the idea of a pseudo concept and a true concept back to front. Not to blame him, he just picked up the overwhelmingly, predominant belief at the time among psychologists and philosophers. But by 1931, when he wrote The History of the Development of the Higher Mental Functions, he completely changed. And that he read Hegel, and he hadn't read Hegel. He discussed with people like Lewin and De Boer and others, and he got it right? So, but there was literature developed in the Vygotskian school prior to 1931 which said that people in pre-literate societies don't have true concepts. Right? And it's quite well known. I mean, I'm sure you've read that book I mentioned, haven't you, Russell? Right? And it's a great book in certain respects, but it contains some ideas that are quite wrong, including this idea that pre-literate communities don't have true concepts. And it's widely held also. Hutchins, Ed Hutchins. Do people know who Ed Hutchins is? No, we're in Australia, not America now, but he's quite highly regarded. You'd have to find out about Ed Hutchins. So what's your name?
Roland.
Roland. Oh, check up on Ed Hutchins because he deals with developed the idea of distributed cognition. He observed people running advanced aircraft carriers as a team, and how they their cognitive abilities were distributed through this whole vast complicated machine, right? And that these machines had all the sorts of methods and they worked together. Okay, well, he did a study of the Trobriand Islanders, and there's one of these people that anthropologists keep going back to. They're the islanders that play cricket. They're really quite intriguing people. But he studied their cognition, and it's really strange reading his books because to give you the context of his investigation, he gives you an intro to the law of inheritance of property ownership in these islands, which are extremely complex. And then he gives you some other story where he's really looking for some sort of a computer program, isolating little bits of information and assembling them into concepts. And of course that's not how conceptual thought works. It's not a digital camera, picking out patterns and doing a bit of pattern recognition and developing, algorithms and so on. I mean, human thought is based on concepts. It's culturally transmitted. It's based in practice and social structures. So he could describe all these advanced concepts of law and right and property inheritance, which were carried on by the elders in that community because they were so subtle and complex. Only the elders really could resolve these kind of disputes, but he didn't recognise them as true concepts. So and he's not a Vygotsky, but he's not fine. He's someone that people in American people that study Vygotsky would know about. Ed Hutchins. He's highly respected in the area. Okay, I thought we'd get through this bit a bit quickly because we made a start on it last week, so I thought I'd throw in a new slide, realising that with all this stuff I hadn't had a word to say about the emotions. So I just want to really give you a very quick sort of 10 minutes on the emotions. Now, it's pretty widely agreed among a variety of schools of psychology that emotions entail the perception of your own bodily reactions to a situation. That, for example, if you're confronted with a dangerous situation, your heart rate goes up and you're in the adrenaline flows, getting ready to either run or fight. And you perceive your own increase in blood pressure, blood going to the head, and kind of things. And that is to do with the sensation of having an emotion. Right? But it turns out that in itself doesn't stand up to detailed analysis. Right? There are more developed theories needed to explain the range of emotions that people feel, especially as adults. So you recognise this little double spiral in the middle. So what we're looking at here again is we're going to understand emotions, like understanding thinking and speech. We have to understand it developmentally. That a newborn is able to cry, but they don't. So that's just pure emotion, like pure expression, or pure expression, put it that way. There's no thought, I'm going to cry in order to get that big female to come and feed me or to put me in a cooler place. That they have a feeling, and that goes, a bodily feeling goes direct to crying. But the function of that expression is communicative, right? You say, oh, so-and-so is only crying to get our sympathy. Well, that's not really the case generally with any adult, unless they're still a child. But children do cry and scream and express various emotions for communicative reasons. So emotions begin as a communicative function, but that's not the end of the story, right? Through the development of thinking and action, of maturation of the psychology, what began as an unconscious expression becomes a private expression. That's to say, it's directed towards yourself. That you can have a bit of a pull a sad face, and you feel these things about sadness. You're not wanting just someone to come over and pat you. But when you're a child, when you pull a long face and maybe drop a tear, one does come over, give you a bit of cuddle, say, there, why don't we go and play, right? So you get to a point whereby you can do that for yourself. The same way that you learn to use your mother's speech, saying, don't touch that, it's dirty, and the child's then saying, oh, mustn't touch that, dirty, and so on, that you learn to respond to your own bodily reactions, and you can comfort yourself, or calm yourself, or whatever. And then finally, the expression may disappear entirely. We can be sad without having a long face and dropping tears and so on. And it can become, the expression can entirely disappear from the outside world, entirely, and be a simply internal thing. We can sense our sadness without any bodily changes whatsoever. It becomes an entirely psychic process. So that's happening on the expression side. Meanwhile, what began as a communicative function, where you simply display your suffering, your happiness, or whatever, in order for social reasons, to communicate it. What takes over is because as you become more autonomous, and that you're able to participate in solving problems and doing things yourself, then the emotions begin to play an action readiness role. Right? The fight or flight thing is a classic example of that. Or if you've done something really bad that your friends are going to really hate you for, then you start getting really small, and you drop your voice a little bit and sort of look down, right? And you keep quiet. Right? So that's the action response for shame. Right? And this leads to the fullest development, where your appraisal of a situation is conceptual. So all through this, the emotion only is possible through your appraisal of a situation. It isn't the bear running into the room that causes the emotion, it's how you appraise that. If you're a skilled, you have to know the bear, you saved his life a year ago, and you say, oh, there you are, Mr. Bear, come on, give us a big hug. No, not so hard, come on, right? Or you might get ready to run. You appraise the situation, and your appraisal, of course, is developing like we've described in the last couple of hours, right? It's developing from immediate perception through acquisition of culturally acquired knowledge, scientific knowledge, and so on, right? And through that, you have self-regulation. So the summary is that there are 4 different elements to the emotions, and the relation between them goes through a development. And you can't just sort of take a snapshot at a certain stage of development, describe the emotion. You have to see it as a process of development. So the appraisal means that how you appraise the situation. Some people, for instance, will kick someone in the shins and get no emotional response from themselves out of it at all. Someone else will get a big kick, and it was great, and see if it got someone else to kick in their skin. someone else will feel really guilty and humiliated for having done such a stupid thing in a moment of anger, right? So you have the appraisal, and the emotion you're going to, your feeling, because often people use the word feeling as different from emotion to include the whole value that's placed on their sort of gut feeling itself. So that appraisal will be part of the feeling. The expression, like the action readiness or communicative crying, or the inward feeling towards self-regulation, or the body feedback, which is, for instance, when you feel your heart going faster, or when you're suddenly losing breath, or you feel your chill run up the back of your spine. All these things are the bodily sensations which are part of the feeling and development of emotions. And the subjective experience is really just the sum of all those things. I think I could have used the word feeling for that subjective experience. That's the appraisal of the situation. Let's say not just the colours and lights of the situation, but it's how it is as a predicament, as a situation for you, added together with the way your body is reacting to that unconsciously, and your expression to that, right? And that adds up to what an emotion is. So it's a complex thing. It includes both your relationship to the world, your relationship to your own body, and it develops. And these different factors or aspects of emotion, their relationship between them develops in the course of your life. The baby's crying is not the same as the old person's crying. So.